On this day, Dr. Carson, I want to start with this. Have you ever had a run-in during your life as an adult or as a younger man with law enforcement that you thought was influenced, at least in somewhat, by your race?
I would say there were potential run-ins with law enforcement, but I was taught as a young person how to respond appropriately to authority. Therefore, it never really escalated into anything serious.
Well, so talk about the potential in terms of what situation you remember most sort of emotionally or distinctly where you did have the potential to come head-to-head with law enforcement. How old were you? What were the circumstances?
Well, I can remember, as a teenager, being stopped by police. I didn't think I was doing anything particularly wrong. But rather than being confrontational about it, I just said, "Officer, what am I doing wrong? What would you suggest?" And actually, I think he was kind of put off by the fact that I was so polite. And that was pretty much the end of that situation.
Would you counsel that same response to other people stopped by police?
Well, I certainly believe that, for the most part, the police are good people to have. And if you don't believe that, imagine living where you live for 24 hours with no police. Imagine the chaos and the horror that would ensue. Are there people who are, crooked? Of course there are, in virtually everything, in my profession, in everything. But the vast majority are decent, law-abiding citizens. What we need to do, though, in situations like Ferguson, there are a lot of young males. Michael Brown wasn't one of them, but a lot of young males in inner cities who grew up in homes with no father figure. They never really learn how to relate to authority in the proper way. And eventually they run into it and aren't exactly sure how to react. Or they run into someone else in their neighborhood who's badder than they are. In either case, it turns out to be a disaster. That's why there were dozens of such young people killed today in America, and yesterday, and tomorrow. Perhaps we should be thinking about why that is occurring, and maybe we could come up with some solutions.
And does any of the onus in your mind lie with the government, with the police, for these outcomes?
Well, you obviously would want to look at statistics and see how often it's occurring. And if it is occurring, if there is true evidence of discrimination, I would say to people, you have the ability to expose things and you have the ability to vote. As you probably know, in Ferguson, only 12% of the population voted in the last statewide election. That's not really exercising your power in the appropriate way. Allowing oneself to be manipulated into violence, which then leads to militarization of the police, which then leads to more of the people in your neighborhood getting hurt or killed, perhaps is not the smartest way to go about it. Maybe there are better ways to remedy an ill in society.
Dr. Carson, I want to move to a foreign policy question, a bit of a history question. What's your understanding of the basis that President Bush 43 used, the rationale he used to go into Iraq with military force, and was it a good idea in retrospect?
Well, my thinking is that he thought that there were weapons of mass destruction and that Saddam Hussein was one of the people behind 9/11 and behind a lot of the mischief going on in the world. And therefore, he felt that it was justified in doing that. There are a lot of people who fall on different sides of that argument. I personally thought that there were probably better ways to handle it.
I'm sorry, Dr. Carson, you said one of the reasons President Bush went in was because he thought Saddam Hussein was involved with 9/11?
He thought that was a potential and that he was involved with a lot of the mischief going on in that part of the world, and that he had weapons of mass destruction.
But you think in retrospect it was a mistake for President Bush to do that?
Well, I don't think it was a mistake to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but I think there are probably more effective ways of doing that.
Dr. Carson,
things that would not have led to the loss of life and the incredible expense that we went through unnecessarily
Dr. Carson, the big news of the day, at least so far, is Chuck Hagel's ouster as defense secretary. You're a surgeon, and surgeons aren't well known for advertising their foreign policy views. So tell us, if you would, why do you think Hagel had to go?
Well, clearly, when President Obama was talking about ISIS early on, and he said that they were junior league, Hagel obviously disagreed with that. And, you know, it appears that he was not really included in the very tightest of inner circles of the decision makers. And I don't believe that he was all that thrilled with the micromanagement that is going on. You know, one of the real problems with our foreign policy, we have an excellent military. We have extremely smart and capable military leaders. But when you try to micromanage them, you're always going to get into these kinds of problems.
Dr. Carson.
And you have to define a mission for them and allow them to accomplish the mission.
Dr. Carson, who do you think the best chairman in the history of the Federal Reserve was, and why?
Well, you know, we hear a lot about the last guy. He's quite old now. Greenspan.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously he had a lot of good things to say and was really kind of a legendary figure, liked by members of most parties.
Is he your choice for best Fed chairman? And if
So
so, why?
Well, one of the things that he did, and I think it was probably important, was try to keep the inflation under control. And you have to admit that you know, a continuation of those policies has worked extraordinarily well. On the other hand, you know, the manipulation of money and money markets and the printing of money perhaps in some ways is not the best long-term strategy. You know, one of the reasons that we as a nation are able to sustain, for instance, an almost $18 trillion national debt is because we have the ability to print money and because we're the reserve currency of the world. What if we weren't? And what if we didn't have that ability? Have you ever really stopped to think about what the implications of that would be?